As a self-proclaimed Game of Thrones expert, a question I get very often is, who exactly are the White Walkers? Where did they come from? What is their purpose? Why are they marching? All remain sort of unanswered. To be quite honest, the answers to these questions are very complicated. This video wouldn't be nearly as difficult to make if it weren't for the stark differences between the White Walkers of the books and the White Walkers of the show. I'm here today to give you the most clear and concise answer possible at this point in both the books and the show. I'm warning you, it's going to be a tad bit complicated, but if you have any specific questions by the time this video is over, feel free to comment them below and I'll gladly answer. When it comes to the show, we have a definitive answer to the question of who the White Walkers are and where they came from. In order to clearly explain this answer, I have to dive a bit into ancient Westerosi history. So before humans arrived at the continent, Westeros was originally inhabited by a race known as the Children of the Forest. In the show, we saw the last remnants of this race in the Cave of the Free-Eyed Raven during Bran's story arc. These were a magical race of humanoid creatures that worshipped the old gods and lived in relative peace across the continent. It wasn't until the first men arrived in Westeros that issues began to arise. You see, when the first men came to Westeros, they didn't do so in peace. Similar to how European colonists came to the Americas and began to wipe out all the Native Americans, the first men did this to the Children of the Forest. In desperation to maintain at least some of their hold on the continent and keep their species alive, they created a super weapon of sorts. This weapon was none other than the White Walkers. The Children of the Forest would kidnap humans and use magic-infused dragon glass to transform these humans into White Walkers. The White Walkers eventually gained a sentience of their own and turned on the Children of the Forest. It was at this point that the Children of the Forest had to set aside their differences with the First Men, ally with them, and defeat the White Walkers once and for all. This alliance, potentially led by Azor Ahai, was able to push the White Walker forces to the lands of Always Winter. After this, it seemed that the continent was at peace. This show explanation answers most of the questions about the White Walkers, except for the reason for their return now. I'm praying that we'll get answers to this question in Season 7 and it won't just remain a glaring plot hole. My personal theory is that somehow some sort of humans on the continent of Westeros violated some sort of treaty that may have been formed with the White Walkers back in the ancient times. There's obviously no confirmation and no validity to this theory, but it's what I'm going to stick with until we get a proper explanation. Well, my friends, I wish I could simply end the video here, but this is where the major trickery with explaining the White Walkers comes. The books don't tell the same White Walker narrative that the show does. Instead, we're left with two major plausibilities. The first plausibility is very similar to the route that the show took, with minor changes in the timeline to reflect historical events that weren't mentioned in the show. However, where the real trickery of this subject comes in is with the concept of the Great Other. In the books, the White Walkers are often referred to as others, with their true leader being known as the Great Other. Not to confuse the Great Other with the Night's King, they're two completely separate concepts, and I will get to that. The Great Other is a concept that derives from the Red Priesthood, the group of people who worshipped R'hllor, otherwise known as the Red God and the Lord of Light. Primemost in both the show and the books being Melisandre. You see, in her religion, despite all of its followers worshipping the Lord of Light, that's not their only god. There's also an evil god that coexists with the Lord of Light in a yin-yang sort of relationship. This god is none other than the Great Other. According to the faith of R'hllor, the Great Other created the Others, otherwise known as the White Walkers, to instill his dominion on the mortal realm. In a large-scale mythical war known as the War for the Dawn, Azor Ahai, otherwise known as the Prince Who Is Promised, led humanity to drive back the White Walkers. Here you clearly see two clashing narratives that both have equal validity at this point in the books. I'm guessing the true White Walker narrative will be a mix of these two stories, but it gets even more complicated when you get into the Far East, locations like Yi Ti and things like that, which I'm not even going to dabble into today. Now you may be saying, Professor, what about the Night King, the guy that leads the White Walkers? To be clear, when I'm referring to the show's Night King, I will call him the Night King. When I'm referring to the book's Night King, I will call him the Night's King. That is the distinction that the showrunners made, and it's the distinction I'm going to make today. So starting with the Night King of the show, he was the first man turned into a White Walker by the Children of the Forest, so naturally when they gained sentience, he assumed leadership. It doesn't seem like the Great Other is a concept they're going to be using in the show, especially since Melisandre doesn't mention it very much, or even at all, if I can recall. Therefore, the leadership of the White Walker forces sort of lands on the Night King. Now, the show Night King is inspired by a historical figure from the books known as the Night's King. The Night's King was actually the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He was on a mission beyond the Wall when he encountered and was seduced by what is probably, but not 100% confirmed, a female White Walker. She essentially took over his mind, and together they ruled Castle Black and the area beyond the Wall near there. He would use members of the Night's Watch to perform grotesque sacrifices and terrorize the land of the area. He wasn't defeated until the Wildlings, believe it or not, formed an alliance with the Starks. It's unclear what happened to the female White Walker that initially seduced him. She could have been killed alongside of him or could have escaped back to the rest of the White Walkers. However, other than creation, what makes this story so different from the Night King of the show is that the Night's King wasn't the leader of the White Walkers at all. He was a servant. It was discovered by the Starks and the Wildlings after his death that he was making these sacrifices to appease the rest of the White Walkers. He was in servitude to the White Walker forces, who in turn were probably in servitude to the Great Other. This leads to, in the books at least, a much stronger validity of the Great Other leadership theory. So I know we covered a lot of material today, but there's still one more point I would like to make to clarify confusion that I see very often amongst show watchers. This is the difference between the White Walkers and the Whites. The White Walkers are only the select few leaders of the Whites. Wrinkly blue people with the bright blue eyes and the icy skin that you see on horses usually. They have the ability to turn any living thing that's died back from the dead into one of their undead servants. These undead servants, this mass army that you see, those are the Whites. So we've really only seen very few White Walkers in the show, while we've seen thousands upon thousands of Whites. I hope you guys enjoyed this explanation. Remember, if you have any questions at all, feel free to comment them below and I'll gladly respond. If any of the questions are strong enough, they may even turn into separate videos. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. All of that helps me out immensely. Most importantly, remember, the Professor of Thrones is here to teach you.